Hey there, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We've been reading Buried Beneath the Boarding House, and this is the 9th episode. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you can go into the playlists and start any true crime book we've covered from the very beginning. Let's get into episode 9 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. Black Widow. Dorothea was an old hand at prison life by this point, with years of experience under her belt. She made the natural transition from being a young debutante under the wing of the motherly elders of the prison to being in the parental role to the young women of the block, who came around for advice and to listen to her many tales, a few of which were even true. She played up her innocence whenever she was in public, but in private conversations with the younger women, she would let little details slip that might help them in their criminal careers, passing on her wisdom to the next generation in exactly the same way that had been done to her. She loved to talk so much that she would ignore the usual divisions within the prison, passing through different gangs and racial divides without anyone batting an eyelid. Here, she was well liked by everyone, right up until the moment that her flapping mouth got her into trouble 3 years into her sentence. Nobody minded Dorothea spreading gossip around the prison. In fact, she was a pretty reliable means of communicating information across the invisible borders within the building. But there was a massive difference between sharing gossip with other prisoners and talking to the guards. One of them was expected and helpful. The other was tantamount to treason against the natural order of things. When the name of the person responsible for an assault in the prison came to the guard's ears via Dorothea's mouth, the response had to be swift and brutal to make sure that no other prisoners thought it a good way to curry favor and preferable treatment from their oppressors. Cornered in the showers, Dorothea was beaten within an inch of her life and left to bleed on the tiles. She was transferred first to the hospital wing, where her cracked ribs were wrapped, then moved along into solitary confinement and protective custody until things died down. As it turned out, things wouldn't die down for almost a year. The inner faction fighting that had prompted the initial assault flared up the moment that the punishments were handed down to the perpetrators. And as more and more of the gang leaders were tossed into solitary confinement, so too went the only means of keeping their respective gangs under control. All of this meant nothing to Dorothea, however. All that she knew was boredom and loneliness. In desperation, she finally turned to the prison pen pal scheme that she had always treated with derision before, and through it, she found a sort of revival. In her letters, she could be anyone. She had all the time she needed to plot and plan her exact words and get her story straight before she had to send it off. Every half-fumbled lie that had earned her looks of doubt and confusion could be smoothed into a part of a grander story. It was the perfect medium for her to reinvent herself all over again. And with her gift for storytelling, she was a hit with all of her correspondents. One of the men who wrote to her almost daily soon became a favorite and the focus of more and more of her attentions. Everson Gilmuth. Everson was a retired gentleman currently living in Oregon. He was a widower with several children whom he rarely saw, and he was so intensely lonely that he had turned to women's prisons in a vain hunt for some sense of companionship. By all accounts, He was a lovely gentleman with a lot of love to give, but absolutely no idea how to go about dating now that he was in his early 70s. He was lost, and in Dorothea, he thought that he had found a new anchor to the world and new hope for the future. Their early correspondence soon blossomed into friendship, if you can call a one-sided relationship based entirely on deception a friendship. Soon, they were shooting back and forth daily replies, and he was dropping cash into her commissary account so that she could keep herself in the manner to which she was accustomed to for the remainder of her stay. By the time that Dorothea had been returned to the general population of the prison, and her mail was no longer being so closely monitored, talk had moved on from mere friendship to a more serious relationship, and the two of them made plans for their future together. Everson planned to move to Sacramento so that they could live together, and there was talk about a wedding. It was everything that the young Dorothea, obsessed with being loved and cherished by a husband, would have dreamed of. But Everson arrived too late to find that woman. Instead, he was sending letters to the woman who had killed her best friend for the price of a plane ticket. The woman who had drugged and robbed the men who took an interest in her so that she could stockpile their wealth and maintain her luxurious lifestyle. A cold-hearted, calculating killer. After 3 years in prison, Dorothea was released on parole, and Everson was parked outside waiting to collect her in his shiny, red 1980 Ford pickup. The two of them embraced. She planted a chaste kiss on his lips, and they headed off to the rest of their lives together. All 3 months of it. The original boarding house on F Street had passed into new hands and was undergoing renovations, but with Everson's wealth behind her as collateral, Dorothea was able to get a new, smaller house and apartment further down the street. The two of them opened a joint account together in preparation for the wedding, and Everson redirected his substantial pension there so that they could start demonstrating their income in advance of mortgaging the new boarding house. They were smiling when they went into the bank together to sign all of their respective papers, but behind her mask of sanity, Dorothea was already making plans to ensure that the pension went on paying forever and that Everson wasn't around to collect it. For all that, there were new elements to the scheme. It was much the same as all of her other fraudulent pension thefts. Bank transfers were intercepted rather than checks, but the mechanics of the rest were the same. The only real difference was that this man wasn't going to disappear, leaving the money to flow without a little bit of intervention on her part. Her reputation among the upper crust may have been beyond salvation after her prison term, but the people of Sacramento seemed to remember her fondly, in particular the social workers, illegal immigrants, and homeless addicts who had so often relied on her charity to make their lives more manageable. First, the local Mexican women started to filter through their door. Then the homeless and the alcoholics whom she had helped to survive and thrive before. She had never lost their trust or their acceptance. Every one of them had been on the receiving end of the heavy hand of the law before, and they knew that what was right and what was legal only crossed over on occasion. Dorothea's confidence grew with each new visitor until her story began to warp in response to their adoration. She was no longer the repentant criminal who had made a few mistakes while trying to do right by the people of Sacramento. Now, she was a martyr to the unfair legal system that punished those who tried their best to help people in need. One by one, all of her old friends reappeared, asking favors or offering assistance. Everson was amazed at how beloved Dorothea seemed to be within the community of Sacramento, and Dorothea was amazed in turn at how easily the officials of the social work department turned a blind eye to the terms of her parole and began filling her new building up with the lost and forgotten who'd fallen through the cracks of society and into her hands. The homeless population was like a vast ocean of bodies, and like any liquid, it would flow out to fill any space that was made for it. This time around, Dorothea was a little more selective in the people that she took in, but not in the way that other boarding houses selected their clients. She chose the very worst and most hopeless cases to be her residents, the people who were almost guaranteed to vanish within a month and never to return, the alcoholics and drug addicts, the mentally ill, and the criminals that everyone else would have turned away at a glance. Again, Everson was amazed at the kindness and charity of his new bride-to-be. He couldn't understand how an upstanding woman like her could have found herself in prison. Reality and the stories that Dorothea spun just didn't add up. When the truth finally arrived for Everson Gilmuth, he recognized it too late. He had loved the beautiful lie that Dorothea had woven before his eyes, and when the ugly truth behind it was revealed, he didn't know how to respond. He was laid out in what was meant to be their marriage bed, too weak to move, too sluggish to do much more than moan and groan. Just as Ruth had died, so too went Everson. The moment of his peaceful death, drifting off into a drug-induced haze, was where the similarity between Dorothea's two crimes abruptly ended. There would be no gentle handling by the police this time around. There was no way that she could get away with handing them a body twice and face no charges, particularly when she was already out on parole. Worse yet, while Ruth's body being filled to bursting with drugs was almost expected, Everson had been in inexplicably good health. An autopsy would reveal that Dorothea was behind Everson's death, which implicated her in Ruth's passing as well. She couldn't risk the body to be officially processed, which meant she couldn't allow the body to be found. If Everson's corpse vanished, it would have the additional benefit of his continued legal survival. If the world still believed that Everson was alive, then the money that he was due would continue to be delivered into the joint account that he shared with Dorothea. With his death, Everson had let out a glut of filth from every orifice, as most people do. The bed was soaked with his vomit and urine and excrement, along with all of the forensic evidence that could easily be used to convict Dorothea of his murder if it were found. So, in a stroke of genius, Dorothea created her own means of corpse disposal based on her experience as a nurse's aide. She wrapped Everson in the bedclothes like a massive cocoon, then sewed the tainted sheets closed. When that proved insufficient to contain his oozing, she then wrapped the whole thing in plastic sheeting, wrapping layer after layer around the body until nothing but the faint stench of death could escape. Even this was only a temporary solution to the problem, of course. The corpse and its wrappings still had to be transported out of the house, and this was where Dorothea's strength seemed to fail her. She was by no stretch of the imagination the frail elderly woman that she presented herself to society as, By 1985, she was only 56, and her time in prison had left her with quite a robust musculature underneath her concealing modest dresses. But even so, she couldn't carry the dead body of a man out of the house alone. The second phase of her plan tackled that problem. Through her prison and social work connections and her ties to the Hispanic community, Dorothea had a direct line to a great many ex-convicts to whom she offered work in exchange for cash payment. They had served as her personal staff throughout the reconditioning work on the new boarding house, just as they had the first, and many of them expected to find ongoing handyman work around the building after being taken under La Doctora's wing. It was well known that working for her was a ticket to an easier life. She offered very fair payment for work that others wouldn't even give to a convict or an ex-convict. She judged each individual on their merits without any consideration for the crimes of which they were accused, and as long as she was never crossed, she could be the best friend that someone fresh from jail could ever have. There were even rumors that she had set young men up with a wife if they planned on settling down and making a life for themselves outside of prison. As long as Dorothea was on an ex-convict's side, they were on easy street. One ex-con who was hoping to adjust to life on the outside in comfort was Ismael Flores. Trained as a carpenter and a furniture reupholsterer before his jail time, he had expected his skills to earn him pride of a place in Dorothea's collection of useful young men, but even he was surprised at her generosity towards him. She wanted some donated wood paneling installed in her upper floor apartment above the main boarding house, and she was willing to pay Ismael considerably more than it was worth to get it done. In exchange for his services, she offered him an almost new red Ford pickup. She explained to him that her boyfriend had moved out to Hollywood and wouldn't be needing it anymore. Ismael was taken aback and protested that it was far too generous a payment. So Dorothea added a little more work to his load to even the scales. If Ismael would panel her apartment and construct a 6-foot-long storage box for her old books and assist her in transporting those old books to a storage locker across town, then she'd feel like it had been a fair trade. Even with these extra conditions, it was beyond generous, so Ismael set to work immediately, completing both the paneling and the construction job in record time. He delivered the handcrafted box to Dorothea after his work was done and drove off with a smile on his face to get some dinner. By the time that he returned, the box was not only full, but Dorothea had nailed it shut so nothing can fall out while we're driving. It was a tiny oddity that he didn't think twice about, even as the pair of them wrestled the heavy, musty box down the stairs and onto the back of his pickup. The nailed top saved them a lot of trouble. From there, they took a strange taxi ride, with Dorothea directing every single turn until she abruptly yelled to Ismael to stop at the side of the Garden Highway in Sutter County. She had changed her mind. Nothing in the box was worth keeping. She just wanted to dispose of it. Perplexed, but unwilling to go against the old woman's wishes, Ismael helped her haul the box off the back of the truck and toss it down the slope towards the river. The area was a common dumping ground for unwanted trash, and once the box was tangled up in the undergrowth, it became almost perfectly camouflaged among the other detritus. With the night's work done, Dorothea seemed almost giddy. She went from sour-faced to chattering all the way home, thanking Ismail profusely and sending him off with a little extra spending money in his pocket for all his help. It had been a strange experience, but Ismail didn't have much to base a comparison on. He kept expecting to be called back to the house on F Street to do more work, since the old woman had been so delighted with him. But it was as though he had been cut off cold. He replayed the evening over and over in his head, trying to come up with some way that he might have given offense, but he couldn't think of a thing that he had done wrong. Eventually, he convinced himself that Dorothea had already given him more charity than she could really afford, and that now she had to spread her kindness to others. A free car for a couple of days' work was enough generosity for anyone. Managing the companies and government agencies that tried to contact Everson was easy enough work for Dorothea. She was a master of bureaucracy and forging official letters. But the social aspect of his life was another matter entirely. He had adult children, whom he regularly corresponded with, and if their letters went unanswered, then there would be suspicion and eventually an investigation. Worse yet, Dorothea had no idea when Everson's last letters had gone out, so she didn't know how much of the true story his children already knew. The fantasy that she composed for them had to diverge from reality only after the point when the real Everson had died, to ensure that she didn't contradict anything he had already written. So, in his letters, Everson now complained to his children of being sickly and bedridden, too ill to come and visit them, but nowhere near death's door, so that they didn't have to rush to his side. In themselves, the letters may not have been enough to keep his children away, but with the supplementary material of Dorothea's new letters, introducing herself to the family and explaining how she was caring for Everson, they became convinced that he wasn't trying to spare their feelings. With this ongoing sickness, Everson wrote to them less frequently, but they still received regular updates on his health and outlook from the lovely woman that he had settled down with. Dorothea calculated every letter written in Everson's handwriting to minimize her risk exposure, saving direct communications from beyond the grave for special occasions. In the early months of 1986, Everson Gilmuth's body was discovered on the bank of the river by a fisherman who quite rightly realized that the 6-foot-long box looked almost exactly like a coffin. The police were summoned, but the body had already metamorphosed inside the chrysalis that Dorothea had created. With all of the moisture of the body trapped inside and more damp creeping in from the river, the California heat had petrified the corpse in record time. The body couldn't be identified, and with no report of Everson even going missing, there was no way for them to make the connection. He was filed as a John Doe and buried in a pauper's grave, doomed to be forgotten. His only crime? Trying to love a woman who was incapable of that emotion. That's the end of episode 9 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this new bedtime book series so far, please make sure to hit the like button. Thank you guys so much for being here. I truly appreciate your support in our series, Crying Me to Sleep. Until next time, good night.